everyone, and welcome to the third in our NatWest Markets U.S. Election Podcast Series. I am John Briggs, the Head of Strategy for the Americas.
And I'm Brian Dangerfield, Head of G10FX Strategy here in the U.S.
So Super Tuesday's behind us. Very, very interesting. It's kind of a lot to go through here, but we'll try to really just hit the highlights. From my perspective, and to those listeners who have listened to the last two podcasts, the thing that's really sticks out to me, besides the fact that Biden outperformed expectations, was the issue of momentum. We've talked about this a couple times about just how important momentum's been, and we saw it early with Sanders. We're seeing it now with Biden. How much do you think that South Carolina win contributed, Brian, to giving him some of these edges? And do you think the momentum's durable, or are we going to see another shift?
Well, I think it is durable, and I think South Carolina was a huge turning point in this contest. The narrative around Biden's campaign was that he struggled in early states because he draws a significant amount of support from minority voters, and that narrative really played out not only in South Carolina over the weekend, but also in Super Tuesday, where the former vice president performed very well. Like you said, I think this is an election that's driven by narrative and momentum, where certainly the former vice president now has significant momentum. But it's also an election about ideology. And when we think about the Super Tuesday contest versus the earlier contests really didn't give us a definitive frontrunner from the moderate side. I think Super Tuesday really cemented Joe Biden as that frontrunner. And I think the endorsements and the dropping out of other moderate candidates, Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, including their endorsements, I think those really helped out Vice President Biden. So from an ideological perspective, it seems we finally have a standard bearer for the moderate Democrat, which we really didn't have before Super Tuesday. So for me, that's the big takeaway, is not only did Biden outperform, but he also now has clearly cemented himself as the moderate standard bearer, which we really didn't have. It might have been Bloomberg, it might have been Biden, it might have been one of the other moderates, but now it seems very clearly that it's going to be the former vice president.
Okay, there's a couple things to kind of unpack there. So I'm going to start with Bloomberg. So what's his future now? We've talked about positive momentum, negative momentum. As the listeners the last two calls know, that I was always skeptical of the strategy, but is he, a couple questions here, Brian. Is he going to drop out? Is he going to stay in? If he does drop out, does he throw his money behind Biden? He said that he will support the eventual Democratic nominee, but will he support the moderate in this race of ideologies within the party for the next couple months?
I think he will. So just to start with the first question is, where does Bloomberg go from here? I think Bloomberg's strategy was to insert himself in this race because there was no moderate frontrunner, and that Vice President Biden was seen as a fairly weak moderate frontrunner from the Democratic side. Now that Super Tuesday is over, and we certainly know that Mayor Bloomberg spent quite a bit of his own money advertising in Super Tuesday states specifically to have a strong showing. That strategy was really based on Joe Biden not being a strong frontrunner by this point in the race. Instead, now Biden has really cemented himself in that spot. The path for Bloomberg to win the nomination was always somewhat narrow. In some scenarios, it may have relied on a brokered convention and really having a moderate Democrats really rally behind whoever was the leader. In that case, Bloomberg would have been hoping it was him. Now it feels like it's going to be Biden. So Bloomberg's path to nomination feels extremely narrow, not only because he underperformed on Super Tuesday, but because he underperformed versus another moderate standard bearer for the Democratic side. So I think Bloomberg, has a history of supporting progressive causes. I think he would support the nominee. I think that's the eventual direction this is going. But for Bloomberg, the path to the nomination, it was narrow to begin with, but it's also narrow now because of the way he underperformed, specifically underperforming versus another moderate. It risks the narrative really running away from Bloomberg as someone who can unite the Democrats under a moderate banner, because we already have that person now, and it seems like it's Biden.
Yeah, and to your point, Brian, and this is still up in the air, so this is just using New York Times' latest prediction. 45% of the delegates are predicted to go to Biden, 39 to Sanders, whereas Bloomberg and Warren only got 7 each. And winning American Samoa isn't exactly the banner headline that Bloomberg, I think, was looking for. So now I want you to tell me where I'm wrong, because this is what I think about the results of Super Tuesday. I think that essentially, and this is what markets are reacting to today, and I feel like that's appropriate, I'm assuming that Biden's going to be the Democratic nominee. A couple reasons, and listeners know we haven't hashed this out between us, so we'll see if we agree. If Brian agrees or disagrees with me. I think a two-person race helps Biden because where Bloomberg and Warren both got 7%, for example, in the primary in Super Tuesdays vote shares, and you could argue that those go respectively to the progressive and moderate candidates between Sanders and Biden. But I think that Bloomberg edge, if he does give it, is a huge edge for Biden when it comes to resource. The second thing is the momentum argument. I completely agree with you on that. I think that the next round of states for the rest of the month, some of the West Coast states where Sanders seems to be doing better, like Washington, Biden might struggle, but there's an awful lot of states in the South and the Midwest coming up here that I think that Biden's going to perform pretty well at. So for me, by the end of the month, it might be even more distant than even the narrow 6% differential in delegates as we saw at a Super Tuesday. And lastly, history's on Biden's side. 17 of the last 18 winners of Super Tuesday from either party has become the eventual nominee, even if it took several months. And the one exception to that was Gary Hart in 1988 when he was discovered having an affair during the process. So, that's a pretty notable exception. Am I wrong here? Should the markets not think that Biden's going to be the nominee?
I think the market should adjust to Biden being the eventual nominee. And I think now that a moderate Democrat, a sort of non-Bernie Sanders Democrat, has really cemented himself as the front runner in the race, I think this is going to open up a wave of endorsements of Vice President Biden. I think the Democratic establishment, which I think has always been on the side of the moderates and specifically Joe Biden, has sort of been looking for this opportunity to really throw their weight behind one particular candidate. And Biden felt like the most natural choice for to be that candidate, but he really underperformed in early states. And I think that opened up questions over whether or not his candidacy had the staying power. I think the endorsements and the money are really going to start to pile in now that moderate Democrats see the way is clear to find their to find their standard bearer. And I think that's really the takeaway here is that Bernie Sanders in particular, but also Michael Bloomberg, I think to a lesser extent, really benefited from the fact that the moderate Democrats felt very fractured. Super Tuesday was a moment where moderate Democrats might be able to get over that fractured nature and really rally themselves behind a single candidate. And we've seen how a single moderate candidate really, with momentum can perform in nationwide contests. And so I think you're right. The market should be adjusting in that direction. I think the endorsements are coming. I think the money is coming. And I think the momentum is there. And we haven't really even talked about that much about Bernie Sanders, who coming into Super Tuesday was the front runner. But I think it's very disappointing for him that he wasn't able to win in Minnesota, for example. I think Amy Klobuchar's endorsement of Biden helped him out there. He also wasn't able to win in Massachusetts, certainly his neck of the woods being a Vermont senator. I think in both cases we could say not just a Biden outperformance, but also an underperformance for Sanders, even though he was able to take the top prize, at least it appears based on the voting we have, by winning California.
But the California thing, even to your point, shifting this to Bernie, in California, because Bloomberg performed pretty well there. So if you break it down by ideology, actually the moderate camp, if you add all the moderates together, actually edged out the progressives. So even in the state which Sanders quote unquote won, it's not like he, or even if you add up him and Warren, got more than 50%, and they didn't even edge out the moderates. So, I think that's got to be a little concerning in the place where he was leading some of those polls by some 20%, and I think it's a crack in it. And then just to put some numbers around your fundraising note, because I agree with you completely on that. Even just a couple days after South Carolina, let's put it this way: Biden had raised about $18 million into South Carolina, and then in a few days, just a couple days after that, he raised $5 million. So I would expect that really to roll in. So I do have one other question, which is, how do you think, and this is a bigger picture question, so let's roll with the backdrop that Biden's likely to see a lot more momentum. I do think there's going to be a point where Sanders performs well over one day and the markets get a little more concerned. But in general, I feel like the quote-unquote risk towards one of the progressive candidates that we were worried about, at least from a market perspective, is significantly diminished. When it comes to the politics, when it comes to the election, when it comes to somebody like Sanders who is running on a platform of universal health care at a time when we have a rising pandemic with the coronavirus, Bryant, how does that work into your calculus here when you think about, if the coronavirus worsens a lot, does that help Sanders? Does it help Biden because he's an experienced hand? I mean, how do you think about that?
I think at the very end there you mentioned, I think, the two big questions, sort of the two big points. The first one being for Bernie Sanders, that universal health care seems to look a lot more attractive in an environment where the universe needs more health care, if you will. But on the other side of that is this is the kind of international crisis that requires an experienced hand. And in that sense, Joe Biden is someone who is, has a lot of familiarity. He has been in government. He was the vice president, and he's able to bring that sort of experience into the race. And I think Democrats are now looking at this race as which candidates can beat Trump. Now Biden has really given himself that momentum, that he's answered that question, which is, I'm a candidate who can win. And so I think Democrats are going to start to really respond to that in terms of where we are in this race, with Biden really taking a big step forward on Super Tuesday. John, I'd like to ask you a question. I'll pivot it over to the president. So obviously what matters for markets is who wins in November. How do you feel about President Trump's reelection odds now? Certainly we have coronavirus. We have the equity market taking a hit here. Certainly very busy markets with the Fed's emergency rate cut. How does Super Tuesday and the overall environment play into President Trump's reelection odds? Do you think his odds should be falling because Biden is doing better? Do you think they should be doing better? How do you feel about the overall picture for November?
Yeah, you beat me to it. So I think that a couple things. I think that one of the things that was helping Trump was a high stock market and a strong economy. That looks increasingly shaky, and not just on the stock market front, but on the economic side, because we now forecast that we're going to be in a hair's breadth of a recession. We see very, very slight, a few tenths worth of growth in the first quarter and negative growth in the second quarter. As a reminder, for a technical recession, you need to have two negative quarters in a row. So, even if it isn't a recession, it certainly could feel like one. And, my view is that the situation around the coronavirus is going to get worse. The numbers are going to get scarier. We're going to have more social distancing. Companies are looking, increasing the numbers of companies are banning travel and looking at alternate, work from home, disaster recovery sites, splitting staff, schools potentially closing. I mean, I think this is all a realistic probability. And the question for Trump is, do people go to the leadership and rally around him, or do they criticize what's happening and blame him? I would have thought that there could have been a chance that they rally around him. My issue with that now is that his first press conference on this, when he was talking about 15 cases and it was going to go down to 1, it sounded like a victory lap before you had even started the race. He was using the George Bush landing on the aircraft carrier, but the battles hadn't even started yet. So he kind of put himself in a position to take the blame. So I thought when he put Pence in charge, that was a way of distancing himself from the crisis, potentially creating a fall guy, but also, having somebody else be the point man so he's taken out of it. And he managed to last about 24 hours before he started tweeting about the crisis again and making comments about vaccinations being here in a couple of months, which get contradicted by his own CDC doctors and such. So I think that he's set himself up to be blamed for the government reaction for this because he can't help himself and keep himself away from the media storm on it. And, he has to, as part of the personality, to keep pushing back. So I think that having Biden in the race, personally, I had always thought that Trump would have much greater success against Sanders. Having Biden be the nominee, I think that hurts Trump a little bit. Having the economic outlook faltering, I think that hurts Trump potentially substantially. And I think that the way that he's handled the initial ramping up of cases and concerns here in the U.S. makes him vulnerable to take the blame for it, as opposed to having the people rally around the flag on him. Does that mean at this point I think he's going to lose? Look, there's so many uncertainties, especially on the economic outlook, on the market outlook. Do we get additional monetary stimulus? Yes, we think so. Do we get fiscal stimulus potentially this year, which we have ruled out? I actually think that's quite possible. So there's, we're in markets where every day feels like a lifetime. So, 6 months from now is going to be 7, 8 months is going to be a completely different lifetime. So, but to answer your question, summarize, I think on those 3 points, it makes him more vulnerable to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think what you said at the end there is really important, which is the election feels like a lifetime away, especially after the last week and a half that we've had. For President Trump, who is really a master at changing the narrative, at shifting the focus, one day you're talking about caravans, the next day you're talking about coronavirus, the next day you're talking about who knows what. But this election is in November, and we're talking about first and second quarter growth that are looking flat, if not slightly negative here in the U.S. But if we're looking at a type of V-shaped recovery, if you can get a big push on fiscal stimulus, not only here but globally, major monetary stimulus, if you are heading into the third quarter with growth numbers starting to bounce back to reflect some of that V-shaped recovery, then it's a completely different narrative for President Trump. Because really for electors, there may be a bit of what have you done for me lately. If the third quarter numbers are starting to look better, then maybe we're looking back on this and saying it was too early to price the demise of President Trump. And so timing is going to be everything. Certainly not saying that third quarter is going to be a revival of U.S. growth, but just simply trying to highlight that in November, the conditions on the ground certainly could be, significantly different. Right now, it looks like growth is going to be pretty weak in the first half of the year. And I agree with you. I think that's something that President Trump has really staked his claim on. He's taken significant amount of credit for the strength of the U.S. economy, and I think he's going to have to wear some of the blame if that starts to dull a bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. The fact is that if we're in October and everything's recovered and we went through a terrible period, but we've survived it, he could certainly shift the narrative about how he saved things, and it might be correct. It might be a correct narrative, but from here, it all looks like potentially bad, but things do shift quite often as we've seen of late. And I think that we need to think about other things on the table just for markets. Whereas if things continue to deteriorate, what can Trump do? You and I have talked about reducing tariffs, unilateral actions, things like that he's created in the past that could be bullets in the gun, so to speak, to try to boost markets or boost sentiment. So, but we might need to save that for another day because I think we're running out of time. Brian, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for listening.
Great.
We look forward to the next one.
Thanks everybody.